Let us pray. Eternal God, in the reading of the Scripture, may your word be heard. In the meditations of our hearts, may your word be known. And in the faithfulness of our lives, may your word be shown. Amen. I have enjoyed the conversations that have started this week. After last Sunday's service, Mark Hazen said to me, well, I thought that you would have added another button, and that was and I talked last week about buttons that have been pushed during the week and talking about some of the tragedies and some of the issues. And I hadn't heard that story. I guess I didn't listen to the news that night, but sometimes don't we just want to turn the news off? It gets overwhelming. So the Doctors Without Borders hospital in Afghanistan, the tragedy that occurred there. And then if you look at the peace rally bombing in Ankara, Turkey, just over the weekend. But this is Thanksgiving. So we need to talk, if I'm going to go home today, we need to be talking about things that we are thankful for. And to take the approach of thankfulness as being the place that we start with living our lives faithfully. It's been wonderful that this week there has been a galvanization of community support around our Syrian and Iraqi refugees' cause, to support a family and bring a family over. It began with a Dartmouth High student coming into the office and saying, we want to do something. We want to work with you. We want to raise money. Dartmouth High is going to be working with our group to raise some funds. Susan Patterson, and she was here a lot of the week, made how many dozen cookies? About 40 or 50 dozen cookies, beautifully decorated cookies. And if you had an opportunity to, didn't have an opportunity to get some, there's a few left. And I think that if we make a great enough demand, we'll put the price up. But what you can do is that it's not just limited to what they're suggesting. If you want to make more of a donation, go for it. And we had an announcement, we applied for a grant through Toronto Conference to get started on the program and received a $5,000 grant from the United Church of Canada through Toronto Conference. And we also received a $1,000 anonymous donation to get started on our program. So we're well on our way to bringing a family over. And we'll be talking more about the goal, but that support of reaching out into the community has been wonderful to look at, to experience, to be a part of. And then I've had conversation this week about how to best care for the people in our community in terms of our Christian values and our Christian. And how do we balance the needs of refugee families around the world with the needs of folks that are in our midst? What are some of the things that we can do? What does it mean to be called to be the church? The stewardship theme for the national church this year is called to be the church, and it works on the creed. Called to be the church, to celebrate God's presence, to live with respect in creation, to love and serve others, to seek justice and resist evil, to proclaim Jesus crucified and risen, our judge and our hope. To use those words of the creed as the starting point of our living. The starting point, what it means to be the church, and how we live out of our thankfulness. I'm going to talk a little bit more about thankfulness versus sort of a sense of obligation a little later. But just keep that in mind, is that we need to live out of a sense of abundance. There was an article, this is on. You get sound coming from there. Keeping me honest today, aren't you? On Monday, there was an article in the Herald, and I hope that you had a chance to read it, by Bill Spur. And it was homeless in Halifax, and it was a sleep out for Shelter Nova Scotia that took place in Victoria Park. Anyone see the article? So a few people saw the article, and you can certainly go online and have a look at it. About 80 people showed up to sleep on the ground, to try to recreate in some way. Now, it's not perfect because it never is. You can never fully recreate the sort of sense of being homeless. But what they did was they invited those 80 people to come out and to find some cardboard and to measure out what they needed. Because they were a gathering, they had what the homeless people don't have. They had porta potties. And that's one of the biggest issues for people who are living on the street. And it was a sense of gathering some interest so that people would walk by that evening and say, well, what's going on? To raise some awareness. Now, before they actually went to sleep or tried to sleep, which was very difficult according to the article, they had raised nearly 80% of their $50,000 goal for the Shelter Nova Scotia. One sleeper with a unique perspective was Brendan McGuire, a member of the Legislative Assembly for Halifax Atlantic. He grew up in foster homes and spent a good deal of his adolescence sleeping in places like the lobbies of apartment buildings. He says, I woke up with every siren because you're cold, because your back is sore and your neck is sore. It really makes you aware. I think every decision maker and every politician should probably do this. It makes you aware what people go through. A few dozen students took part. There were families and couples. Robert Strang, the Chief Public Health Officer for the province, was there with his daughter Emma. An interesting article. And then a couple weeks ago, Brian Foster sent me a link to an article from the New York Times that I've been chewing on ever since. Thanks, Brian. David Brooks wrote The Limits of Empathy. And this actually is something that has gone back. Eldon's not here. Eldon and I have had conversation that we've talked about Jesus and Jesus' compassion, especially the word that's used in Greek is splagma, spleen. It's sort of the center of compassion. And Jesus' action and healing is often because of his compassion, reaching out of that place. His empathy of being able to walk in those things. Now, when we've talked about it, we've also haven't made a lot of distinction between compassionate action and moral action or ethics. And there's a difference. And one of the things that David Brooks has me thinking about is some of those limitations around using compassion as a basis for our action. It's important, but we found it's not the best motivating factor, according to Brooks. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to dig into this a little bit. He says, we're surrounded by people trying to make a world a better place. Peace activists bring enemies together so that they can get to know one another and feel each other's pain. School leaders try to attract diverse sets of students so each can understand what it's like to walk in the other shoes. Religious and community groups try to cultivate empathy. As Steven Pinker writes in his mind-altering new book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, we are living in the middle of an empathy craze. There are shelf loads of books about it. The Age of Empathy, The Empathy Gap, The Empathetic Civilization, Teaching Empathy. There's even a brain theory that we have mirror neurons in our heads that enable us to feel what's in each other's people's heads, and that these neurons lead to sympathetic care and moral action. There's a lot of truth to this. We do have mirror neurons in our heads. People who are empathetic are more sensitive to the perspectives and sufferings of others, like those who went out on the sleep out in Nova Scotia. They are more likely to make compassionate moral judgments. The problem comes, he says, when we try to turn feeling into action. Empathy makes you more aware of the other people's suffering, but it's not clear if it actually motivates you to take moral action or prevents you from taking immoral action. He cites a couple of examples. In the early days of the Holocaust, Nazi prison guards sometimes wept as they did what they were ordered. And in the famous Milgram experiments that took place several decades ago, people felt anguish. That was where you were told you had, to give a shock to the person, and although they felt empathy and even felt the pain that the person was experiencing, they still did it because they were told to. Empathy orientates you toward moral action, but it doesn't seem to help much when that action comes at a personal cost. And there have been piles of studies investigating the link between empathy and moral action. Different scholars come to different conclusions, but in a recent paper, Jesse Prince, a philosopher at City University of New York, summarized the research this way. These studies suggest that empathy is not a major player when it comes to moral motivation. Its contribution is negligible in children, modest in adults, and non-existent when costs are significant. Other scholars have called empathy a fragile flower, easily crushed by self-concern. So how do we live with that? That we seek to walk in other people's shoes, but when it really costs us, what do we do? I mean, I'm not against empathy. I preach on it. Probably half the time talking about the compassion and the care that we need to be of the world. But at the same time, how does that translate into action? Does it? Nobody is against empathy, Brooks says. Nonetheless, it is insufficient. It's become a shortcut. And what they're saying on that is what the shortcut is that it tends that we care and look after when our action is empathy motivated, it's the ones that get press. The people in the news. I mean, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to do something with refugees, but why are we doing it? Thank God for that motivation. However, we need to find a better way. I mean, it also, we have a sense that we need to be structured and compelled to act out of our moral center rather than our empathy. Or it needs to be complemented by our empathy, but it's our moral center, those sacred codes that make up our lives. And that perhaps is the problem with society, is that we're not quite sure where those codes are. So we need to find a way to allow those codes, those sacred codes, to motivate us, to move us to action, to move us to be the people that we are called to be. I mean, think about the people that you admire that seem to get this right, regardless of their faith belief systems. I mean, when you look at them, there is a sense that they're doing it because of the code, of this social or philosophical or religious code that they feel is important. Now, this is where I really move away from this particular person's take on it. Because he says that this code is really a sense of obligation, an obligation to some religious or military or social or philosophic code. And if you don't do it, then you're filled with shame and guilt. And that's what motivates you to do it next time. Okay? Well, friends, that's bull. And as a church, we need to realize that we've been complicit in saying that over the centuries. Is that we have tried to get people to act well and care for one another out of a sense of guilt, or that if you don't, you're going to hell. That is ridiculous. We are a people who are filled with the grace of God, the forgiveness of God. We're not perfect. We make mistakes. We are flawed. But at the same time, we come before God who loves us and cares for us and is gracious to us. And that is where the basis of our moral code, our ethical code, must lie. Remember what Paul says? That it is faith, hope, and love. These three abide, and the greatest of these is love. Pursue love. Now, when he's talking about love, it's not this feeling that we get. It is this code of living with respect and creation, to love and serve others, to seek justice, to resist evil. It is living with those values and that reality. Brooke concludes, the code isn't just a set of rules, it's a source of identity. It's pursued with joy. It arouses the strongest emotions and attachments. And if you want to make the world a better place, help people debate, understand, reform, revere, and enact their codes. Except that codes conflict. That's how he ends it. Very interesting. It's had me going around and round in circles for a while, and will continue to. Thanks again, Brian. There's a United Church camp called Camp Bimmy, located just outside of Stratford, Ontario. And in one of the rooms in the main lodge that's used as a staff room during camping season, above its doors are painted the words, "Remember, you never know when you're making a memory." In Judaism, there is a practice of placing a mezuzah on the doorpost of the door that leads in and out of one's house. And inside of every mezuzah, one will find a copy of the prayer that begins, Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. It's a constant reminder for our Jewish brothers and sisters of the presence and place of God in one's life. It's a constant reminder for us who are part of that heritage that God is a part of our life, and we live out of that knowledge and that thankfulness. We respond to that grace, not to a threat of punishment. I wonder what words are on the door frames of your home, on the door frames of your heart. Is it Jesus' interpretation of the great commandment? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Is that it? Is it WWJD or WWJB? What would Jesus do? Where would Jesus be? Or is it perhaps the words that June read? Seek ye first the kingdom of God. What's written on the doorpost of your heart? What is it that causes you to live thankfully, to live with grace? The practice of thanks living, the practice of seeing abundance instead of scarcity, of seeing grace and celebrating it, of being joyful about it. Thanks living is the way that we remind ourselves of God's great love for us and for all of creation. It's a way to make our moments memorable in ways that bring hope and wonder to the world. And just to return quickly to that camp slogan, remember, you never know when you're making a memory. For me, personally, what I'd like to think about is that perhaps in my encounters through the day, that may be the only Christ that they ever see, or that I see in that encounter. It changes the way that you deal with people. It transforms our lives. Friends, let us be a thankful people, and let us share that thankfulness and change our world. Amen.